brings us to the 7 Years' War / French Indian War. This is the same war. Time frame is 1756 to 1763. It's important to know, perhaps, that before 1756, there had already been a bunch of wars between the British and the French and a number of other countries throughout Europe as well. And whenever there was a war in Europe, the combat always ended up filtrating down to the colonies that those European nations might have had. So the American colonists have already fought in several wars of empire between the American French and the American English fighting each other, and sometimes the Spanish too. So this is not going to be anything new, except that this war is kind of the war to end all wars of empire at the time. This 7 Years' War, let me explain this. In 1756, the British were making so much money off of this colonial trade that they had set up, this mercantilist trade that we're going to define again. The British were doing so well economically from this trade coming across the Atlantic Ocean that they're able to finance other forms of conquest and trade. So the British are gaining influence now by the time we get to the 1750s. Remember, the first English colony that was successful was in 1607. That's when that started. So we're now in the 1760s, over 100 years later, and the British is now, the British people are now doing much better economically than they were doing before. Well, England has got a good deal of influence in Central Europe, as do a number of other countries, and that's a different kind of a class that we would talk more about that in. And England really wants access to the East, the way the Portuguese and Spanish do. And so the way the English can do that is they want to take over territory in India, but the French want it, and the Dutch are already there. So there's going to be this big war of empire that starts here called the 7 Years' War. Yes, it goes on for about 7 years, hence the name. While that war is happening, Britain is going to use this war as an excuse, as a justification to raise taxes pretty high on their own people, and then to send armies all over the world for things that they want to further their empire. One theater of this large war is kind of a world war in a way. One theater of this war is over here in North America. This pink region right here, that's French. And so over here, the English colonies are going to be bolstered by new English armies that are going to land. And the English armies, along with some of the colonists, are going to fight against the French colonists. And then over here, because England wants all of this if they can get it, right? And then over here, England is going to be fighting the French largely here in India. And the English are, of course, going to be fighting the monarchs that rule a bunch of different countries here in India. So the beginning of the English occupation of India starts during the 7 Years' War. Big fight here against the French and, of course, Indian kings. Excuse me. And big fight here between the French and the English over the eastern side of North America. So that's what's going on. That's the 7 Years' War. Let's take a closer look now. When we call this the French and Indian War, the reason why Americans call it that is because the Americans that lived here were not fighting against the people over in India, and the Americans here were not fighting against people in Central Europe the way the British were during this war. But the Americans are going to be taking up the British banner, and they're going to be fighting against the French colonies. And most of the natives that lived in North America and the eastern seaboard of North America generally sided with the French in this fight. And it's partially because the French made really good relationships with native tribes, whereas the English were more likely to push the natives away. You know, they would settle and they would build their towns that would grow into cities, and there would be fighting, and the English would just kind of take away through settlements the land of the natives, and the natives would either have to assimilate or die, basically. Whereas the French didn't do that at all. You know, the French experience was, let's move in and make allies with the natives who will then help us make money on furs, and trade, and that sort of thing. And so the natives largely joined the French side. And so the English colonists, the 2 million that were here, are basically fighting a war when the 7 Years' War starts, are fighting the 7 Years' War in this theater. The American colonists are fighting against the French and their Indian allies, and hence the British will call the British that live here will call this the French and Indian War. We're fighting against the French and Indians. That's basically what's going on here. Okay, let's define a couple of things and show you why all this trade is so important, enough so to fight a war of empire over. Why would the British need to go fight a war against France for all this territory in the first place? It's because, man, it's all about the money. I mean, if you look at this, the Empire of England is largely based on this trade called mercantilism, which we'll define in a minute. Again, I think we did. And you're going to have raw goods coming from America. And you can see the raw goods here: whale oil, lumber, furs, and tobacco, and rice, and silk, and sugar, and all these things. Wood, especially, right? All these bits and pieces are going to England. And in England, the industries, the factories here, the very foundations of the British Industrial Revolution, which will be the first of its kind in history, is going to be based on all these goods. These raw goods coming in are going to be what England uses to make manufactured goods. Those manufactured goods, which involve things like guns and cloth and iron and beer and rum, and it's so much more, are going to be making their way back to the colonies. And that's this trade, this system of trade where the colonists send raw goods to England and England sends manufactured goods back to the colonies. That's a symbiotic internal system of trade that bypasses Europe and makes a lot of money for the British without having to do any trade agreements with anybody else in the world. It's their own colonies making money. And then, of course, both sides are sending goods down to Africa, where then slaves will be imported throughout the British Empire, including America, for the cheap labor wing of this system of capitalism. I know I called it mercantilism, but mercantilism is really a very early form of government-managed capitalism. And so what's going on during this time? During this time of trade before the French-Indian War / 7 Years' War happened, what's important to know, guys, is that when we get to, say, the 1630s, there's a lot of turmoil in England. And that turmoil in England is largely political, and it has to do with the rise of power bases in England that are going to change things. I'm being very vague about this because that's not the point of this lecture. There's going to be a fight between a king and parliament. It's a king called Charles I, and Charles I is going to be eventually beheaded by parliament. That's basically if Congress raised an army to fight against the president, and the president had his own army of loyalists. I don't know what that would look like. And the two would fight, and then Parliament won. So in this case for us, the translation would be, imagine if Congress fought a war against the president of Congress. And so that's what eventually happened. So there's this war that goes on for quite a while, and the aftermath of that war goes on for quite a while as well. So from the 1630s all the way into the late 1600s, you've got the English involved in their own internal systems of fighting over control and what kind of rulers they should have and what kind of religion or religious freedom they should have. That was part of this fighting as well. And in the end, why does this matter with America? While this was all going on, the political turmoil of a growing England, we might call this the growing pains in England as their empire grew this island nation into something bigger. While these wars of strife, these civil wars are happening in England, English authorities kind of leave the colonies alone. The American colonies are making a ton of money for England. This trade is going well. And the fighting in England in the middle of the 1600s means that nobody's really watching the colonies. And so the colonies have an opportunity to develop their own unique and distinct personalities because they're not being directly governed. And we're going to define what all that means too. So let me get to these phrases, to these definitions. First of all, mercantilism, that's your economic system that I mentioned, is a system of running and profiting from a colonial empire. It's something that's largely invented by the English when it comes to how big this gets, although the Dutch were doing it a little bit too. And so the Americans produce the raw goods. They send the raw goods to England. England converts raw goods into finished goods and then sells the finished goods back to colonies, right? Internal system of trade. Okay, that's mercantilism. Super simple, making so much money that the English would like more territory to get their raw goods from. and more people to sell their finished goods to. Where can you do that? Well, you can capture the French territory in North America, and therefore you've got more places for colonists to go, produce raw goods to send to England and then to buy English goods, and India, a place where the English can get more raw goods and send colonists to. So that's part of this 7 Years' War. Salutary neglect, super, 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 super important term for our lecture and for, in fact, the next 2 weeks of class. Salutary neglect, when all this strife is happening here, is the English Civil War and more is happening. The English are ignoring the colonies from a governmental standard. There's rule of law in theory, but the governments of the colonies are kind of on their own to manage the colonies without that much direct rule. So salutary neglect is the definition of this. Parliament even made up that term, I think in 1704. Just like, well, how do we manage the colonies? Do we have enough armies to go over there and watch them? Do we want to set up a system of communications vessels, ships to go back and forth across the Atlantic to communicate with each other and carry direct orders from the king or from Parliament to our 13 colonies with 2 million people in them? And the end result was, no, that was just too much money, too much effort, and England was in turmoil. And so they just said, let the colonies govern themselves until we're ready to govern them back. And so salutary neglect is that system. Let's read this here. As long as the colonies provide raw goods cheaply and purchase manufactured goods at market prices from England, then the British will let the colonists mostly govern themselves. Basically, the money's good, and England is too busy with their civil wars and other internal problems, leaving the colonists alone. That's dangerous, guys. That is so dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Well, at the very same time, okay, that all this was happening, English Civil War and the expansion of British colonies across the ocean and other colonies from other countries too, there's something called the Enlightenment happening, okay? And this is also branched into it's related to the scientific revolution. So when you think about guys like, well, I'll show you. Here you go. John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu and Voltaire and Newton, right? And all these guys. And women like Wollstonecraft. And there's just so many people that got involved. Mostly wealthy people. Let's be clear. These are wealthy people. A lot of them were wealthy either as aristocrats. They were already part of wealthy aristocratic families and had the money and time to sit and think about things, deep thoughts about the world. Or they were wealthy because they were part of this economic system of trade. Maybe they owned some ships that were trading back and forth, or they had some plantations that were being run for them in the American colonies somewhere, something like that. And even if they weren't aristocrats, they might have been wealthy off the trade. Either way, these kinds of people, these Enlightenment thinkers, what the French call philosophes, were all over Western Europe during the late 1600s going into the 1700s. And they were people that would meet and they'd talk about politics and the state of man and natural rights and what government should really be like in this new era of learning and understanding. And the Enlightenment was really, again, it's not something that the middle class is talking about much. It's not something that the poor labor classes are talking about. It's something that wealthy people, wealthy, educated people are talking about because they've got time and they've got money. They can, okay? And they're meeting in salons. There's special kinds of rooms where they can talk and special kinds of bars and writing books. And they're writing books for each other, not for anybody else. It's that kind of thing, all right? And so they're their own society of thinkers. John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, and Voltaire, I put them up here because they're just really important for the American mind of this period because they were wealthy Americans also in the colonies. And these wealthy Americans read the writings of guys like this, John Locke and Montesquieu and Voltaire, and then they started to create an American version of these ideas. And so you might recognize John Locke's ideas when we talk about them in a minute as being very similar to, say, some of the thoughts that went into the Declaration of Independence. Who was one of the people that was most influenced by John Locke's philosophies in the American colonies? Thomas Jefferson. Loved John Locke. And the Declaration of Independence is almost entirely ripped off from John Locke's works, right? Called two treatises of government, which is kind of fun. So you've got John Locke, you've got Baron de Montesquieu. When you think about the three branches of government, the executive, the judicial, and the legislative, that is partially an invention of Baron de Montesquieu. That's an idea that the new United States will try when it comes into existence because it was already existing. It was a philosophy. And Voltaire, who writes about the rights of man and how mankind have certain natural rights, which John Locke will also theorize about. Let's talk about the differences between two kinds of Enlightenment thinkers. Thomas Hobbes is an Enlightenment thinker, but he is a conservative of the time Enlightenment thinker who believes that he can argue for why things should not change when it comes to having kings ruling your country. Why do you need dictators to rule the people? Versus John Locke, who is going to argue something very new and different, which is we need to get rid of dictators and we need to have the people ruling themselves. And you can imagine how Thomas Hobbes versus John Locke's ideas are going to be welcomed in, say, England versus in America during this period of salutary neglect. So Thomas Hobbes, humans are, this is just from his book. You know what his book is called? The Leviathan, the giant monster. Okay, just keep that in mind. Humans are naturally cruel, greedy, and selfish. To escape a brutish life of living amongst naturally cruel, greedy, and selfish people, people must enter into a social contract of some kind. This social contract is where you give your rights away to a government that will protect you from the evil other people that live around you. And so he believed, Thomas Hobbes, this is all very brief, and it's so brief it's kind of wrong, okay, that only a powerful government could ensure an orderly society amongst all these greedy, selfish people. And he believed that the only kind of government that can rule the mob, all right, was a monarchy. And so Thomas Hobbes is going to be beloved of the monarchs of Europe. He writes his stuff down and says, listen, this is the way it is. Here's why you need kings. You need kings. Sometimes you have good kings and sometimes you have bad kings. But you always need kings because if you take the king away, you've got anarchy and crazy people running around killing and stealing from each other. All right, period. And that's the way it always is. All right. Then you've got John Locke. John Locke is interesting. You look at him versus him. This guy actually looks like Charles the First or the Second. Same kind of hair and mustache and beard style, clothes even. And then you've got John Locke, and he's here in this picture looking very thoughtful and pensive. Over here, humans, he says, he believes, are naturally reasonable, moral, and good. You see the dichotomy here. Humans have natural rights, John Locke says, which include life, liberty, and property. And if people have those rights, are granted those rights by the government of life, liberty, and property, then they're truly free because they have freedom, they can move around, and they can keep their property without somebody taking it away. And so he says the only reason to have a government, because people can handle themselves, says the only reason that you need a government is for when times get rough or something happens or you got deviance in society or some other country invades your country or there's natural disasters. The only reason you need governments is simply to protect the natural rights. Because John Locke agreed that not all humans were perfect or reasonable or moral or good. He admitted that he believed that they were people that were just bad. And why were they bad? They weren't born bad, he says. It had to do with their environment. If they were raised in a bad environment, then they would grow up to be possibly bad people. People who had moral issues that would prey upon the good people. And so he says, we can fix this. We need a better education system and we need a better economic system and we need to bring people up in a way where they have a better environment. But for now, we need a government to protect people's life, liberty, and property. And that's it. That's all the government needs to do, okay? And then he says the government should have limited power and the government should actually be born out of election, out of a people that select the government. When we get down here, this is where you get the most radical thing that John Locke maybe says. If a government violates people's natural rights, life, liberty, and property, that government has now become tyrannical and the people have the right to overthrow that government and start over. John Locke does not become immediately popular in England. And keep in mind that the reason that he does not become immediately popular in England is because John Locke is English and he's writing about the need to really get rid of a monarchy and replace it with a different kind of government. And while he's saying this, of course, there's a king in England and there's a parliament in England and there's monarchical rule throughout all of Europe. So his ideas are going to be kind of seen as the ravings of a well-educated but naive dude. All right. Whereas Thomas Hobbes, his ideas are going to be largely adopted as being real enlightenment ideas for the way things really are in the monarchy. Well, guys, let's look at this. All right. Remember, salutary neglect. The British government may not have liked John Locke's ideas of natural rights and life, liberty, and property and all that. But guess where those ideas go? The books and all that stuff that John Locke writes, and Montesquieu and Voltaire, those writings end up coming over to other wealthy wealthy British people known as Americans. These are people that own land and they talk with each other and they're educated as well. And you've got colleges like Yale and William and Mary and the other one, Harvard, and you've got these guys that are educated there, and so they're kind of like the American like thinkers. And those might be Washington and Jefferson and Ben Franklin and Adams and so many more. And all these folks are going to be able to entertain the ideas of John Locke, for instance. Whereas in Britain, John Locke's ideas may have been kind of shunned a bit. But in America, under the system of salutary neglect, where the British aren't paying attention to the colonies because the British are dealing with their own problems, well, guess what? Nobody's telling Americans that John Locke's ideas are dangerous or un-English or whatever. Okay? So these ideas over the course of like 80 years become, well understood in America. These ideas of John Locke, especially, are going to become understood as being normal ideas to live by. And so if the British ever get rid of salutary neglect, like they're going to do at the end of the 7 Years' War / French Indian War, if the British ever get rid of salutary neglect, guess what? These ideas are suddenly going to be told as being wrong and to the American colonists by the British, and the American colonists might not take kindly to that idea. So salutary neglect made sense because the British were busy with their own problems and couldn't govern a colony 4,000 miles away. But on the other hand, the British not governing those colonies directly means that ideas like this can gain traction in those colonies 4,000 miles away, meaning the American colonists who call themselves British are developing a very different understanding of what their ideas are. Okay? It doesn't help also that there's a very different system of living in America compared to the British colonies. Monarchies, rigid class structures, no way to really move up and down the class structures in Europe. America, you've got these kind of elected governments with a royal officer at the head, and then you've got a lot of people who can move up and down the social ladder depending on the choices they make and the economy that's there. You've got a lot of freedom of movement, America, which means you've got a lot of people spouting off those ideas from Locke. Life, liberty, and property. Has become common terms. You've got people like this. You've got this guy. I don't know if you recognize him. He's known as Paul Revere. Paul Revere is a guy that started fairly poor, but Paul Revere is going to be a silversmith. And he's going to be known as a silversmith in the colonies. And Paul Revere, as a silversmith, is going to gain enough money that he can use that money to buy himself a printing press. He's going to print papers that talk about his ideas of the American mind. And a lot of it's rather outrageous and propagandistic, but Paul Revere is going to be a well-known man and a wealthy man. And if there was a class structure in America that was like that in England, he would be a lord of some kind. It's just that was not possible in the English class structure system, but he was a wealthy dude. Over here, Ben Franklin. Okay, Ben Franklin. He is an indentured servant. Ben Franklin starts out as basically a sold man. He actually has a 7-year contract that he works for a printing press in Pennsylvania, and he's got to work off that contract as a kid. But he's smart enough to be able to save up some money, buys his contract out, and then starts his own press, which is going to make him famous. because he's a very good writer and he's able to put out all kinds of almanacs and newspapers and books that are going to make him an international sensation. He's a celebrity by the time he's 25. And and this is not something that's nearly as possible in, say, England as it is in America, because there's just this sort of social ladder movement that doesn't exist. And people are going to want to protect that when push comes to shove. I want to show you this. Come on. Don't you think Paul Revere looks just a little bit like Jack Black? Don't you think? I mean, just a little, right? He's there. If anybody knows Jack Black, would you talk to him a bit and see if he knows anything about his heritage? Is he related to anybody from New England? I want to know. All right? That's just a weird thing. Okay. So, how does this 7 Years' War get going? How does it relate to the American colonies? Let's get to it. This is a place called Fort Duquesne from satellite. All right. Fort Duquesne, also known today as Fort Pitt. The city that exists today around this whole region is called Pittsburgh. All right. And that's where the first major battle that's going to start off what will become the 7 Years' War happens. Okay. It's going to be a global war between the English, the Spanish, the French, and many more. And that war begins, weirdly, in the middle of the forest at a small wooden fort called Fort Pitt or Fort Duquesne. Okay. A couple things about this. All right. About the French-Indian War, again, also known as the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that will bring the British leadership, who were practicing salutary neglect, lazy governmental management of the colonies, will bring British leadership into direct contact with the colonies for the first time. And this war is going to open up a whole new era of the rising costs of an empire that's going to require that British leadership to reorganize that empire. And when they reorganize that empire, they may do a few things, like, say, get rid of salutary neglect. And that's going to result in some real problems in the American colonies. All right. So these are our two main points of this war that really affect what happens over here in North America. Here are the colonies of the time, the American colonies. Oops. Oh, that was weird. Pushing the wrong button. There we go. New England, including Massachusetts and Maine, all the way down to Connecticut. Then you've got middle America, the middle colonies from New York all the way down to about Delaware. And then the southern colonies from Virginia all the way down to Georgia. All right, these are the colonies. And by the time we get to this war in the 1750s, 1756, we got about 2.5 million people living. All right. Now, right here along this interesting border is this territory, this geographical feature known as the Appalachian Mountains, and it's a big, dense forest here as well. So the Appalachian Mountains are here, which is why the American colonists haven't really gone much further than this boundary. And then on this side, you've got the French colonists and here's your province of Quebec right there, right? The French colonists and their Indian allies, their native allies. So, okay, a couple points to make here. We have here in the Ohio Valley, which is over kind of near where that Pittsburgh city is, the Ohio Valley, there's all these, there's French that live there, all right? And the British have decided that, and this is before a war is declared, that they're going to send an army in to claim that territory. They don't know that the French are there yet. They just want to claim it. They want to expand colonial territory. So basically, this is like dangling a big carrot over the region, hoping to encourage a war to happen. There's 1,000 British troops. Those British troops arrived from England. They're being led by a guy named General Braddock. All right. And with those 1,000 British troops are 400 colonists. Those 400 colonists are being led by a local plantation owner named George Washington. And he's been elected as a colonel, not in the British Army, but in his own little kind of colonial militia. So Colonel George Washington and 1,000 British troops are going to leave from the city of Baltimore in Maryland, and they're going to march over the Appalachian Mountains and come down into Pittsburgh, or where Pittsburgh is today. And their job is to build a fort there. And by building the fort, they claim the territory, hopefully before the French do. This is going to happen all over this region. There is a British army that leaves from New York and goes to this place called Fort Niagara, successfully builds a British fort right here. There's another British army that leaves from New York, goes north, and builds a fort right here in a place called Crown Point. And then you've got, coming out of Baltimore near Annapolis, You've got a British army with George Washington involved with, going to Fort Duquesne, which will one day become Fort Pitt after the British fight a war there. Now the deal is that Fort Niagara, British name; Crown Point, British name; Fort Duquesne, hey, French name. The 1,000 man army that makes it here. This is 1 year before the war starts, before the 7 Years' War starts. This English army that makes it to Fort Duquesne is going to find, after they've marched for months to get there, that the French are already there and they've built a fort. That British army is going to be in deep trouble because it is now surrounded by, well, it's on this trail. It's on this trail. This is the actual trail. And you've got this British army all wearing red coats, by the way, and white trousers. And they're in the middle of a road that they themselves had to build to get to a French fortress that already existed. Okay. And so here they are in this really awkward position where a 1,000-man British army goes to a place that they're going to claim and finds that the French are already there. Now, the French do not want the British army to get back to report in Baltimore that the French are already building forts here, because then the French will know that the British will send more troops. And so what happens is you're going to see a situation where the French are going to send their Indian allies, their native allies, to attack and destroy that British army, hoping that the confusion of the disappearance of that British army will lead to a long delay in any further troops coming out. Okay, because the French want to build more forts, get ready for what they know is coming, which is a war. Okay, so Braddock's mission to build a fort where Pittsburgh is today is a failure. Okay, and you notice this 1,000 casualties. So what happens is there's this fight where the natives are going to attack, and I'm going to play a video for you on that right here. Okay, so in the end, you've got 1,000 casualties. 1,000 British troops are killed, including Braddock, and a number of the Americans are going to get away because they run away under George Washington's leadership, knowing that there was no way to win against that attack that you just saw. So the deal is, guys, is that in America, George Washington is going to be a hero. He saved his colonists from death, from an ambush that nobody can beat. He saved American colonists and brought them home to their families. However, in Britain, George Washington is going to be a bad guy because George Washington left these 1,000 British troops and he took his 400 colonists and took them away and ran away and left 1,000 British troops to die alone in this ambush. So George Washington is immediately seen as a hero by Americans, and he's going to be seen as being kind of a jerk to the British. All right, just keep that in mind. All right. So this is the excuse for war, and this war has already started. So we call the war something that's begun in 1754 goes to 1763. The players, Britain and Prussia versus France and Spain. And I've already shown you maps for this, but this is where the war is fought, right? And let's be clear, the war does not go well for the British in North America for some years. It goes well for the British everywhere else. The British Navy does an excellent job defeating the French everywhere it goes. Okay, so when it comes to India, no problem for the British. All right, when it comes to beating European armies in Central Europe, the British can do that too. But taking British troops and having them land in America, going across the colonies over the Appalachian Mountains, and fighting the natives that are allied with the French throughout the American colonies, that's tough. That's real tough because that's not the kind of fighting the British are trained to do. And so here's a video on that story right here. Okay, so we're back. So you see how this was kind of a bad fight for the British. Well, what happens is there's a new prime minister brought in to basically fix the North American problem, where the war has stalled there. And this prime minister is named, William Pitt. And William Pitt is going to deal with the colonists very much as equals, whereas other prime ministers kind of saw the colonists as country bumpkins, it's just colonists. He's going to treat the colonists like British citizens. And he actually talks to colonial leaders and says, we need your help to win this fight. The colonists at no point have really been asked to go wholesale into this war. The 7 Years' War was something the British were fighting as part of the War of Empire, and they expected the colonists to help, but they didn't really tell the colonists to help, and they didn't get the colonists really invested as in a what's in it for the colonists kind of way to fight in this war. And so the colonists were just kind of there doing their thing, sometimes helping as volunteers, until this moment. And this is where William Pitt is going to actually talk to colonial leaders. And he's going to promise to repay the colonists for anything the colonists provide, labor and supplies for the armies that are marching into the forest to fight, right? And expansion. He's going to promise that the colonists are going to be allowed to expand into conquered French territory as long as the British war. And so this is all very good for the colonists, and they join in. And so with colonial help, finally, thanks to William Pitt, the war will finally end where the British managed to conquer North America, or the eastern part of North America. So the Treaty of Paris, all right, one of many treaties of Paris. England is going to get Canada, all of Canada. England is going to get French lands east of the Mississippi. And then England is going to take Florida from Spain. This is basically a spanking to Spain, who didn't really fight in this war much, but they did join the French side. So, whatever, right? Spain is going to receive land west of the Mississippi and the city of New Orleans from the French. Why does Spain get this, even though they were on the other side? It's kind of a peace offering, okay? I'm going to show you the maps. And then finally, France is allowed to keep a couple of islands in the Caribbean. That's it. The French lose their territory in India. The French lose their territory in North America. The French lose a lot of power in Europe as a result of this war and losing it. And the French only get to keep a couple of islands in the Caribbean. That's it. So the French Empire is gone for now. And here we go. This is the French colonies of North America. And here's what the English were already claiming here and here. And then this is the Spanish territory, right? Once the war is over, once the 7 years / French Indian Wars are over, you've got the English with all this territory here, which is all the English thought they would ever need. And the Spanish are allowed to expand here, again, as a peace offering. That was just to kind of say, let's bury the hatchet. No more fighting between the English and the Spanish, because honestly, the English have enough. They've got India. They've got this territory here. The English are doing pretty well for themselves. Okay, so let's start to close this up. Greatly enlarged English debt is one of the biggest effects of the 7 Years' War. England may have a new colonial empire, both in India and America, but England has spent so much money and taken so many loans to fight this war that they are in debt. They are in deep trouble. And Britain is going to have some contempt for the colonials. Part of that is because of George Washington, all right, and it kind of starts there. But the other problem is that the British have a really dark view of how the Americans have been treating their governmental systems. The Americans have elected governments. The Americans believe largely in the idea of life, liberty, and property because they thought that that was normal. Nobody ever told them that that wasn't normal, you know? And the Americans like being British. They like being part of the empire that makes them money. What the British do not like, or sorry, the American colonists do not like being told what to do directly. They don't like that at all. And so when the British army show up in America to fight this war against the French, the British army is bringing officers that are members of parliament. They're people that are going to go home and be in charge of parts of the British government as members of parliament. They are lords of Britain that govern these armies. And so when the British armies come and they're being governed, they're being run by these lords of Britain, who then go home and say those colonists are out of control, these guys. The British start to feel that they need to maybe rein in the colonies a little. And that's where there's going to be some problems, all right?
In February 1763, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Paris, ending at last the 7 Years' War. King George III now rules more territory across the globe than was ever held by the Roman Empire. But the territory in North America is now so vast, the British must find a new way to manage it. Money. The war had doubled Britain's national debt. British taxpayers had long shouldered the burden. Now Parliament expected American colonists to pay their share. A small tax on paper, the Stamp Act, causes an unexpectedly violent reaction in the colonies. Riots break out. Tax officials are burned in effigy and forced from their jobs. The tax is widely ignored. Why is the reaction so incendiary? The root of colonial frustrations can be traced to the French and Indian War. As far back as 1755, General Braddock had met resistance when he demanded the colonists pay toward the cost of the war.
You cannot tell me you have not the power to make these little assemblies do the king's will.
The relationship changed when William Pitt became the king's prime minister and treated the colonists with respect.
Letters, gentlemen, from London.
They had been happy to contribute to the war effort as long as they were considered full partners in the empire with the same rights as people in Britain. But now, Parliament imposes this new tax without their consent. The colonists feel betrayed. In New England, a clash of expectations leads to mounting tension. British rule is seen as heavy-handed. A riot ends when redcoats kill 5 in what colonists call the Boston Massacre. They see Britain as riding roughshod over the rights of colonial assemblies. Radicals increasingly assert the right of self-rule. In December 1773, things come to a head over yet another tax, this time on tea. Britain's reaction to the Boston Tea Party is severe. The Crown floods Boston with troops and rewrites the colony's charter. In April 1775, Fighting erupts in Massachusetts between colonial and British forces. This is no longer a family feud, a dispute between loyal members of the empire. Once blood has been shed, there's no going back. In 1754, no one in America imagined that a backwoods territorial dispute would end up transforming the world. But the French and Indian War did just that. By eliminating France's empire in North America, by allowing British leaders to believe they could exercise power without restraint, by convincing colonists they had no choice but to resist that power, even to the point of revolution, and by depriving Indian people of the allies needed to help protect their land and their autonomy. No one expected any of this to happen, but by changing the face of the continent, the French and Indian War became the war that made America.
Here's the slide here. 1765, Britain wants to maintain an army of about 10,000 soldiers and officials in the colonies to enforce new trade rules and to basically control the colonies a bit more, like limiting smuggling and such, right? The traditional rule in the colonies, what all the colonists were used to, was that taxes upon the colonies could only be legally made at the approval of local colonial legislatures. This was the way that English Parliament handled colonial relations before the 7 Years' War. After the 7 Years' War, when salutary neglect is removed, the British are going to try something new, which is instead of having colonial representatives approve the taxes, King George and Parliament are simply going to issue taxes on the colonies and see if they will just accept those taxes without any kind of approvals process. This is the way it's going to be. There was a feeling of respect between Britain and the colonies before, and now there's more of a feeling of direct rule, where you've got the king telling the colonists, like a petulant child, pay or else, okay? And so the colonists are going to feel that this is very aggressive and intrusive upon their rights, and the colonists are going to feel like Britain is being incredibly hostile, really. Well, I'll think of it. In any case, the deal is that this is the change that happens in the colonies regarding their system of rule, okay? And the colonists are going to react to this. A lot of colonists will. Taxes, all right. Oh yeah, I should mention that the one thing that could have been done, but was not, was, remember, this whole issue is that the colonies are going to be protesting the idea that the British will just change this on them. We'll just change the idea that the colonial governments get to have an approvals process and a process that they create of how to pay taxes to the government of Britain. It's not that the colonies haven't paid taxes, it's just that they had a way that they got to have their own way to handle it, I mean to say. Well, the deal is that if England had let the colonies somehow have parliamentary representation, have a seat in Parliament somewhere, this might not have been such an issue. I'm not sure about that. It's revisionist history for me to say that for sure. But it may not have been such a problem. The idea of having involvement in Parliament would have given the colonies more power, and they would have liked that, I think. However, instead of giving the colonies the chance to continue doing what they were doing, which was to be told by the king that taxes were needed, and the colonies were allowed to decide how they raised those taxes and how they paid the king, instead you now have the king simply saying, you owe me taxes, pay it or not die, kind of thing. It was a very different way of treating the colonies. And so this is a problem, okay? So what happens? You're going to have a series of taxes that will be met by greater and greater protests. And when we say protests, we're talking about boycotts and tar and feathering of officials from time to time. And we're mostly talking about people just kind of going into the streets and protesting, mostly. So the first tax is just on sugar. British sugar coming to the colonies, and the way the colonists handled it was simply to not buy sugar for a while. Okay. Then there was a stamp tax, and the stamp tax was a stamp on everything that really required paper. And it's the British Empire, so everything requires paper. There's records for everything. So there's simply an extra tax on top of everything that requires a receipt, a bill, a license, anything like that. And there's now a tax on it. So the colonists couldn't really escape this. They couldn't just not live, So they had to pay these taxes, and they really hated it. And then a guy named Lord Townshend comes in, who is going to be a prime minister of England. And Lord Townshend is going to make some new rules with what the British can do in the colonies. And so, wow, this is going to get crazy. So I want to give you this quote from John Dickinson. He was one of the most outspoken colonial leaders when it came to the idea of the British just being allowed to tax the colonies without any kind of colonial involvement or parliamentary representation or anything like that, right? His big statement, paying the British tax is worse than slavery, it is death, he says, right? It's the end of a letter he put into a newspaper. Another quote of his, it is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people that no taxes be imposed upon them but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. So this sort of thing is obviously some ideas that the colonists have about how they handle the rule of their country, whereas maybe the British government doesn't understand that the colonies have these ideas. Where did the colonists get these ideas? Again, salutary neglect, right? The British just weren't paying attention for a while, and the Enlightenment came in, right? And so the Americans have these ideas. Okay, so let's get there. If you're Lord Townshend, you finally take over Parliament, and one of your jobs is to figure out how to get the colonists to stop protesting and to basically play the game. And so what is he going to do? He's going to raise a new series of duties, of laws that increase taxes on the colonies, but he's using them in a very interesting way, okay? So what he wants to do is bring in more soldiers, which is only going to increase the problem between the British authorities and the colonists, as far as protests go. But he wants to bring in more soldiers, and he wants to replace the royal governors in the colonies with new ones that are directly being working with himself. All right. So he wants to get rid of basically colonial governments and replace them with his own government. And then he's going to repeal parliamentary rules, okay, that allowed colonial legislatures to approve taxes. So they're going to overturn right here. Lord Townshend is really the guy, Townshend is really the guy that is going to remove the right of approval from the colonists. Basically, this is the official overturning of salutary neglect. And that's where things are going to get really ugly. And I'm going to show you why. So far, it seems pretty mild. And the taxes are only on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. But what is it that people are going to be allowed to do, meaning officials are going to be allowed to do to convince the colonists with a tyrannical arm that they need to allow British authority complete rule and to have people watching them at all times, this customs enforcement? Let me show you part of the Townshend Acts, okay? A revenue should be raised in America for making a more and certain adequate provision for the civil government. What this means is that the Townshend Acts, and the colonists will read this and will start to protest, is a new series of taxes specifically designed to replace the American system of government. So all those colonial legislatures in 13 colonies can be, if necessary, replaced by this Townshend Act, right? That's huge. And then we go down further and look what British soldiers and officers are allowed to do in America. They're not allowed to do this at this point in their own country, in Great Britain, but they can in the colonies. And the colonists are fully aware of that disparity. It is now lawful for any officer of His Majesty's Customs Authority to take a constable, that's like a sheriff, unto a place and go into any house, shop, cellar, warehouse, or room, or other place, and in case of resistance, to break open doors, chests, trunks, and other packages there, to seize, and from thence to bring any kind of goods or merchandise whatsoever, and put them in the Majesty's storehouses. I want you to imagine in this era of time, this time of the Enlightenment, this time of John Locke, this time where American colonists are saying, maybe all men are created equal or whatever, right? I want you to imagine in this time, the British Army actually making a law so that it's legal for them to go and just break into people's stuff and take it if they want to. Because that's basically what this is. There are even further laws that go forth and say that British officials will no longer be answerable to colonial law. So if they do something, let's say they actually kill somebody or harm somebody in the process, well, normally there would be a court trial. But under Townshend, there would no longer be a court trial. It was just the American colonies were something new now to the British, which was a complete direct ruled colony. So you have events like this, like the Boston Massacre, which was very engineered, but still it happens where you've got people going up against each other in some very visual way, right? And we finally get to this. Between 1774 and 1782, America, Britain, Prussia, and France will fight again. But this time, it is the French and Americans versus the British and Prussians. And ultimately, so this is going to be an opportunity for France to try to kind of beat the British back a little bit and repay the British for what they did in the 7 Years' War, which was to kick France out of all of their colonies. The deal is that this event is called the American War of Independence. And the American War of Independence is almost like a 7 Years' War Part 2 in so many ways. And so America and France versus Prussia and Britain. And you've got that war. You may have heard that there were Hessians and kind of German-speaking soldiers coming into America to fight the war. Those were mercenaries hired by the British. Some of them came out of Prussia, and some of them came out of Hanover. Let's see. So that's it for the lecture. What you're going to be looking at this week is the arguments in Parliament regarding treating the colonies so differently that they would actually result in an actual war of independence. How does this happen? And you'll be reading the documents of Edmund Burke, who makes the case in Parliament that the people of Parliament, the lawmakers, need to be very careful with what they're doing and how they're treating the colonies. Thank you very much. Enjoy.